When Russia invaded Ukraine, cultural institutions were the only ones who actually did something. First, they cancelled the Russian premiere of The Batman. Uncharted became the last big Hollywood movie for the pre-war Russia. That's why we're the only ones who actually remember the movie. Then Netflix left the country and cancelled all the original shows that it had planned to make in Russia. And I, as a writer who almost sold them a pilot, took it like a man. Disney Plus never even launched in Russia, so we never had a chance to support Jimmy Kimmel. Sorry, Jimmy. Modern art exhibitions closed, world-class architects stopped their Moscow projects, and theater directors who had worked with Russian state theaters went home and gave long interviews about how much they hated taking Putin's money. Imagine Dragons cancelled their Russian and Ukrainian shows and made headlines for being on the right side of history. A year later, they played in Azerbaijan, because those wars and that dictator don't get as much media coverage. Meanwhile, the UN strongly condemned the war. The West finally stopped selling dual-use electronics to Russia in 2025, and they stopped buying Russian oil and gas. They didn't. Despite my whataboutism, I am strongly against the Russian invasion. I was a pretty successful independent comedian in Russia, but then I spoke out against the war and eventually had to leave. You can read about it in this very cheerful Washington Post article. I managed to survive outside my home country thanks to my comedy and my English, skills I owe to the Western culture. But a lot of younger people in Russia will not have that chance because they will lose access to American and European content. Let's find out how you can culturally isolate a whole country in the 21st century. First of all, Russians lost live shows. Big events like the Pain Festival were cancelled. Yes, it says a lot about Russia that we had a festival named Pain, and it was one of the biggest events for the indie scene. In 2022, Nick Cave was supposed to headline it, but apparently Russians do not deserve pain and sadness. Then the big three, Sony Music, Warner and Universal, made their new music unavailable in Russia. The first big album we didn't get was Kendrick Lamar's Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, which is ironic because an album about letting go of your messiah complex and going to therapy was exactly what Russians needed in 2022. Then the streaming platforms themselves started leaving. The French one, Deezer, was among the first, which made a lot of Russians say, "What's Deezer?" People joked that Deezer gave up first because they're French. Anyway, then Spotify left. And we had history with Spotify. People waited for it for years. We used VPNs and foreign accounts to be the part of this big cultural thing. We even had a popular Twitter account called "Has Spotify Launched in Russia?" Finally, in 2020, Russian savages joined the civilized world. There were billboards, parties, influencers even got scarves with the Spotify logo. I was offered one, but never got it, which says a lot about how influential I was. And just 2 years later, Spotify has closed their operations in Russia. It's hard to blame them. The Russian government had started censoring the political podcasts, the ones dozens of people listened to. Local hip-hop artists didn't wait for a knock on the door. They scrubbed their songs of any mentions of drugs and gay sex, and it was a big part of their legacy. But people didn't want to let go of Spotify. They had already tasted this life. The life where your streaming service keeps recommending you the same shit every day and you pretend that it's discovering new music. Revolutionary. And people needed an escape. They wanted to hide from the war inside playlists like Rainy Day Jazz or Sad Girl Gloom, or relaxing music for dogs, my personal favorite. A whole new industry emerged. For a small fee, you could join a Spotify family in some country where both human life and subscriptions are cheap. And honestly, it's the only way for most of us to be a part of a family with the good taste in music. Since I had already left Russia, I got my Spotify back the civilized way. I walked half of Istanbul trying to find a bank manager who liked Russia just enough to open me an account. Apple Music, though, stayed in Russia, the worst one of them all. By the way, Apple regularly removes VPN apps from the Russian App Store. God forbid Russians get access to independent media. And when the Russian government fines Apple for something, they pay. Apple pays them all. Meanwhile, Google owes Russia 2 undecillion rubles. That's about $2 decillion, a number with 33 zeros. But given current inflation in Russia, it can quickly become like $7. By the way, Russia has no longer access to music from the major labels, but most independent ones are still available. And honestly, I don't think it's a real punishment. If you can still listen to Thom Yorke and Jamie XX but Ed Sheeran is unavailable, that actually sounds like an upgrade in user experience. The situation with books is even more interesting. Russians cannot buy official editions of Stephen King because they are not allowed to experience fear. And they cannot read J.K. Rowling because they are not supposed to know how to overthrow a bold evil wizard. By the way, Vladimir Putin once defended J.K. Rowling for her anti-trans rhetoric. He said she was a victim of the cancel culture. Haha, Dobby supports J.K. Rowling. If I were J.K. Rowling, I would seriously reconsider my beliefs. Because if Vladimir Putin is on your side, you may have taken a very wrong turn somewhere in life. Anyway, Russians still read new novels by J.K. Rowling and Stephen King. How? They are illegally published in Luhansk. It's a Ukrainian city in the occupied Luhansk People's Republic. We are used to hearing that soldiers there take over people's apartments. Now they have taken a book from an old man. This so-called publishing house is called Trophy Book, which kinda says it all. These hit novels are considered trophies for the Russian army. They fought bravely to capture those files and print them out. It's like those trophy wives that rich men in the West have. Something you get just because you're richer and more privileged. Movies can also become trophies. There is a website called Tsargrad, owned by Konstantin Malofeev, the Orthodox billionaire. We don't have time to unpack that. The website is famous for its attacks on the LGBTQ community. For example, once they announced an event called Send a Sodomite to Paris. They actually ended up saying an openly gay man to Paris on their money. It was supposed to be some kind of a conservative gesture, but it turned out the most gay-friendly thing that the Russian media has ever done. Usually the site publishes news about defeating the Western values with God's help, but in 2024 they kinda launched their own streaming service. There you could watch Hollywood movies that were unavailable through official channels. For a while it was the only place on the Russian internet where you could still see the scene where man kissed Ryan Gosling on the cheek. Other websites cut that scene out because of the gay propaganda. But it's a Christian website, you are supposed to turn the other cheek. You can still watch Hollywood movies in Russian movie theaters, just not officially. Theater owners still hope to go back to normal, that's why they do not advertise that they're basically stealing American movies. They usually do it through short films. People officially buy tickets to see a short movie, as people usually do, right? And after that short movie they can stay and watch a longer movie, which may or may not be a Marvel movie. It seems like Russia is the only country on earth where short movies directors actually make money. For example, a short called Three Good Deeds officially grossed 846 million rubles, that's around $10 million. Or if inflation keeps going, about $4. But in reality, the director of this short earned 15,000 rubles, which is roughly a cheeseburger. Where did the rest of the money go? Nobody knows. Where do movie theaters get the files to show them? They download them. My friends once missed the premiere of one battle after another because they couldn't finish torrenting it before showtime. I don't want to be a rat, but the Russian movie theater chains get their files from Kazakhstan. They get them fast, in good quality and already dubbed in Russian. In 2022, Kazakhstan gave Russia new movies and got in return the IT and tech professionals fleeing mobilization. Fair trade. And let's not forget about Russia's Facebook clone VK. From the very beginning, it's been a massive warehouse of pirated movies and TV shows. For a while, VK tried to be a part of the civilized internet and to fight the piracy. But when the war started, it went back to basics. VK was also a huge source of the pirated porn, which honestly helped people manage their stress under the dictatorship. I do not know what is the situation now. I do not watch porn on VK. I have a wife and Twitter. Western musicians still perform in Russia. Here, for example, you can see Exhibit performing in Moscow at a festival organized by the sports department. Then there's As I Lay Dying. Their frontman literally hired someone to murder his wife, and then they did a show in Moscow. If he kills someone there, he can always volunteer and go to the war, like a lot of criminals do. And then he will really be laying dying. Kanye also made an appearance in Moscow. There were even rumors about his arena shows, but they never happened. At this point, it's hard to tell who's a bigger liability to whom. Kanye for Russia or Russia for Kanye. 69 still performs in Russia, although everybody calls him a snitch. In Russia, that's an offense worse than anything Kanye has ever done. When a country is that isolated, your reputation as an artist or an athlete doesn't really matter. For example, a few football players accused of domestic violence joined the Russian football clubs. One of the biggest stars in the Russian Premier League was Quincy Promes, a Dutch player. At home, he was accused of drug smuggling and a knife attack, but Russia doesn't extradite to Europe. However, football players are not exactly known for their IQ. So Quincy went to a training camp to UAE, and the UAE does extradite people to Europe. So Mr. Promes will be now spending a few years in the Dutch prison. He is planning to revive his hip-hop career while he's in there, which says a lot about the prison system in the Netherlands. It will be funny if Quincy Promes's new tracks end up being unavailable in Russian streaming services. But of course, it's all just an adjustment period. People used to say that nobody in post-Soviet countries would ever pay for the licensed content, but subscriptions ended up winning. It's just way easier to add your credit card and pay a small fee than digging through horrible websites where hot women want to meet you. Nobody believes that. People will always choose an easier way. Of course, people want to keep Spotify and Ryan Gosling. But more and more people switch to Turkish soap operas because they never left. And also they tell a story about an absolute monarch that imprisons the Russian beauty. Relatable. Live-action remakes of old Russian fairy tales are smashing box office records. Children's stories used to be a refuge for anti-government writers. But now they're just a way to distract people from rising taxes, disappearing friends, and exploding drones. People are increasingly left alone with how the Russian government sees culture. You can watch The Last of Us on Russia's so-called YouTube killer RuTube. It was supposed to replace YouTube after it was blocked in Russia, but creators refused to move there no matter what. So this site also became a pirate content dumpster. So yeah, The Last of Us there, both seasons. Except for that third episode about Bill and Frank. Because obviously it's a filler episode that adds nothing to the story. Right? Right? Not because it's about two gay characters. Russian streaming services also cut the entire storyline about Vitos Patafori's homosexuality from The Sopranos. Now the show looks like gangsters have problems all the time, except for the 5th season. Nothing really happens in the 5th season. Guys just take a breather. Twin Peaks lost its trans women played by David Duchovny. So now when David Lynch yells at FBI agents, "Fix your hearts or die," it comes out of nowhere. Although, to be fair, it's always cool to yell at the FBI. A huge part of culture simply disappears because the Russian government doesn't like it. When Paolo Pasolini's biography was published in Russia, every mention of LGBTQ issues was blacked out. And now it looks like a piece of modern art. People whose voices were never heard in Russia are now even further away from being normal members of the society. And international culture that could have helped is gone too. Years and years ago, I decided to do comedy because I saw specials by George Carlin, Louis C.K. and Eddie Izzard, a trans person. They were so good that they made me learn English and go to my first open mics. 10 years later, I left Russia and escaped prison or the army. My university degree has nothing to do with it. It's only because I had access to comedy in English. And if that kind of content becomes unavailable, someone in Russia will never have this chance. Of course, I am not defending Russia. I don't even have the audience for that. I'm not a right-wing podcaster. I just want to say, culture does not stop wars, but it does give people hope. And by trying to block a whole country, you've taken away the hope for a few cool people. It is your right to do so, but it's not what culture is about.